The autumn rain fell like cold needles against the cobblestones of St. Lo, a small market town in Normandy that had once smelled of fresh bread and apple blossoms. Now, in October 1943, it reeked of diesel fuel, boot leather, and fear. Dorothy May Sullivan stood in the doorway of what used to be her aunt's bakery, watching German soldiers march past in perfect formation, their jackboots echoing off the medieval stone walls that had witnessed 8 centuries of history, but nothing quite like this. She was 24 years old, with callous hands and eyes that had seen too much, too soon. In the corner of the crumbling storage room behind her sat an old bicycle, its frame spotted with rust, its chain squeaking like a dying animal, its tires patched so many times they resembled a quilt. The German officers who requisitioned supplies from the bakery every morning would laugh at it, pointing and making jokes in their harsh, guttural language. They called it Das Rostige Fahrrad, the rusty bicycle. They had no idea it would become their nightmare. Dorothy hadn't planned to become a resistance fighter. 6 years earlier, she'd been a schoolteacher in Hartford, Connecticut, living a quiet life of grammar lessons and Sunday church services, dreaming of nothing more adventurous than a summer trip to Cape Cod. But in 1938, her mother's sister, Aunt Marguerite, had fallen ill in France, and Dorothy, the only unmarried daughter in a family of 5, was sent across the Atlantic to care for her. She learned French from the locals, learned to bake baguettes in the wood-fired oven, learned the rhythms of a Norman town, where everyone knew everyone and secrets were currency. When the Germans invaded in 1940, her family begged her to come home, but Aunt Marguerite had passed, leaving Dorothy the bakery, and by then, leaving felt like abandonment. She'd watch her neighbors' sons dragged away for forced labor. She'd watch the Goldstein family, who ran the bookshop, vanish one night, their store windows smashed, their books burned in the square. She'd watch France bleed, and something inside her hardened into steel. Now, before I continue with Dorothy's story, I want to pause for just a moment. I know that our audience is made of intelligent and discerning people like you, individuals who recognize the depth and importance of these untold histories. These aren't just stories. They're testaments to human courage that shape the world we live in today. If you value content that honors these forgotten heroes with the respect and detail they deserve, please subscribe to our channel. Help us continue bringing these powerful narratives to light. Now, let me take you deeper into Dorothy's world, because what happened next would test every ounce of her courage. The resistance network in St. Lo operated like a spider's web, invisible until you were caught in it. Dorothy had been recruited on a February morning in 1942 by a man who simply walked into bakery and ordered a specific type of bread, pain de campagne with extra salt. It was a code she'd been told to watch for by Madame Chunault, the elderly woman who sold flowers in the market and who turned out to be the local resistance leader. The man's name was Marcel, and he had deep-set eyes that never quite looked at you directly, always scanning doorways, windows, faces in the crowd. He told Dorothy they needed her because she was American, because she had papers the Germans rarely questioned, and because a woman on a bicycle delivering bread was the most invisible thing in occupied France. She said yes without hesitation, though her hand shook so badly she dropped an entire tray of rolls. For 18 months, Dorothy's role had been simple: carry messages folded inside baguettes, hide documents in flour sacks, memorize information, and whisper it to the right people. She learned to move through the town like a ghost, friendly enough that the German soldiers recognized her and waved, invisible enough that they never really saw her. She learned which officers could be distracted with a smile, which ones were dangerous, which ones drank too much and talked too freely. She learned to read the rhythms of occupation like a musical score, when patrols changed, when supply trucks arrived, when tensions rose or fell. She learned to sleep with one ear always open, to wake at the slightest sound, to trust no one completely except Madame Chunault and Marcel. She learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite the terror that lived permanently in her chest like a second heartbeat. The bicycle had belonged to Aunt Marguerite's late husband, Uncle Pierre, who had been a postman before the Great War. It was a heavy, ancient thing, built in the 1920s with a steel frame that weighed as much as a young child. The rust had accumulated over years of being stored in the damp cellar, creating orange-brown patterns that looked like continents on a map. The leather seat was cracked and patched with canvas. The handlebars were wrapped in cloth that had once been white, but was now the color of old newspapers. One pedal squeaked with every rotation, a sound that could be heard half a block away. Dorothy had wanted to fix it, to make it quieter, but Marcel had stopped her. "They need to hear you coming," he'd said, his voice flat and certain. "A silent bicycle is suspicious. A noisy one is just another part of the landscape." So she kept it exactly as it was. This ridiculous, humiliating, impossible machine that made German soldiers smirk and French collaborators shake their heads in pity. The autumn of 1943 brought changes that rippled through the resistance like tremors before an earthquake. Allied forces were advancing in Italy. The Soviets were pushing back in the east. The Germans were growing more desperate, more brutal, more unpredictable. In St. Lo, they'd increased patrols, established new checkpoints, begun random searches that could mean death if you were carrying the wrong thing. 3 resistance members had been executed in September, their bodies left hanging in the town square for 2 days as a warning. Dorothy had known one of them, a young man named Henri who taught her how to identify German military ranks by their uniforms. She walked past his body twice a day, forcing herself to look, forcing herself to remember why this mattered. At night, she locked herself in the bakery's small upstairs bedroom and cried until her throat was raw, then washed her face and went downstairs to knead dough before dawn, because the bread still needed to be baked and life impossibly still needed to be lived. In mid-October, Marcel came to her with a proposal that was less a request than a test. The Allies were planning increased bombing raids on German supply lines, but they needed intelligence, exact locations, exact timing, exact cargo. A major supply depot had been established just outside St. Lo, in an old farm estate that the Germans had requisitioned. Trucks came and went at all hours, carrying everything from ammunition to food to medical supplies. The resistance needed someone to map the patterns, count the trucks, identify the cargo, and, if possible, discover the schedule. It was dangerous work that required multiple trips past German checkpoints, required being seen repeatedly in a restricted area, required a reason to be there that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Marcel looked at Dorothy's bicycle and then at her face, and she understood before he even spoke. "You'll be delivering bread to the German outpost near the depot," he said, 3 times a week. They've already approved it. They want fresh bread for the officers' mess. You'll be expected, you'll be watched, and you'll need to see everything without appearing to see anything at all. Dorothy's first trip to the depot was on a Thursday morning when fog hung over the Norman countryside like a shroud. She loaded her bicycle's front basket with 6 loaves of bread wrapped in cloth, checked that her papers were in order, and set out along the narrow road that wound through fields where farmers had once grown wheat and barley, but now grew only weeds and neglect. The checkpoint at the town's edge was manned by 2 young soldiers who barely looked at her documents, just waved her through with bored indifference. The ride took 35 minutes, and every rotation of that squeaking pedal felt like an announcement of her presence. She passed burned-out farmhouses, abandoned barns, fences torn down for firewood. She passed a field where a single cow stood alone, ribs showing through its hide. She passed a tree where someone had carved the words Vive la France into bark, and someone else had tried to scratch them out. The world felt emptied of everything except gray sky, gray earth, and the gray weight of oppression. The depot was exactly as Marcel had described it, a sprawling farm estate surrounded by new barbed wire fencing, with guard towers at each corner and German soldiers patrolling the perimeter. The main house, a beautiful Norman-style manor with half-timber walls and a slate roof, had been converted into an administrative building. The barns had been reinforced and expanded, now housing rows of supply trucks and equipment. Dorothy could see at least 20 trucks parked in neat lines, their canvas covers marked with German military insignia. She counted them as she approached, her mind automatically categorizing. Cargo trucks, fuel trucks, ambulances, transport vehicles. The gate guard checked her papers, made a crude joke about her bicycle in broken French, and let her through. She rode slowly past the barns, pretending to struggle with the heavy bicycle, using the opportunity to observe everything. Stacks of wooden crates, barrels marked with warning symbols, soldiers loading and unloading supplies, an officer checking a clipboard, 2 mechanics working on a truck engine. She absorbed it all, filed away in her memory, and delivered her bread to the officer's mess with a smile that hurt her face. Over the following weeks, Dorothy became a fixture at the depot. She arrived every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at approximately the same time, always with fresh bread, always with that ridiculous squeaking bicycle, always with the same shy smile and limited French that made the Germans think she was simple and harmless. She learned their routines. She learned that supply trucks arrived from the north every Monday and Thursday night. She learned that fuel shipments came on Wednesday mornings. She learned that the night guard changed at 10 o'clock and that there was a 15-minute window when the back gate was less carefully watched. She learned the names of the officers who were kind and the names of those who were cruel. She learned that the depot was a crucial hub for German operations in the region, supplying troops along the entire Norman coast. And she passed every detail to Marcel, who passed it to his contacts, who passed it up the chain to Allied intelligence in London. By November, the weather had turned bitter. Ice formed on the bicycle's handlebars. Dorothy's fingers went numb inside her thin gloves. The morning rides became an exercise in endurance, pushing through wind that felt like knives, through cold that settled into her bones and refused to leave. But she kept going because stopping wasn't an option, because people were depending on her, because every piece of information she gathered might save Allied lives when the invasion came. And it was coming. Everyone in the resistance knew it, felt it like electricity in the air. The Germans knew it too. Their desperation manifested in increased brutality, in roundups and executions, in a paranoia that made every interaction potentially deadly. Dorothy learned to carry cyanide capsules sewn into her coat hem, just in case. She learned to sleep with her shoes on. She learned to say goodbye to Marcel and Madame Chunall each time, as if it might be the last, because it very well could be. The plan crystallized on a December evening when the first snow began to fall. Marcel came to the bakery after curfew, slipping to the back door like smoke, and spread a hand-drawn map across the flour-dusted work table. His face was gray with exhaustion and something else, excitement perhaps, or terror. "London wants to hit the depot," he said without preamble. "Major bombing raid, coordinated with sabotage on the ground. They're planning for late January, when the weather clears enough for accurate bombing runs. But they need the trucks to be full, loaded with maximum supplies. They need to know the schedule, and they need someone to mark the primary targets." He looked at Dorothy with an expression she couldn't quite read. "They want to use thermite charges. Small but effective, placed correctly on fuel trucks and ammunition transports. They create a firestorm that would make the bombing raid devastatingly effective. The problem is placement. We need someone who can get close enough to the trucks, repeatedly, without suspicion. Someone who already has access." Dorothy felt her stomach drop. Thermite was an incendiary compound, magnesium and iron oxide, that burned at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit and couldn't be extinguished with water. Small charges, properly placed, could turn a supply truck into an inferno in seconds. But placing them required physical access, required touching the vehicles, required time and privacy that didn't exist at a heavily guarded German depot. "How would I carry them?" she asked, and her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Marcel produced a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were what looked like thick metal buttons, each no larger than a coin. "These are the charges," he said. "Chemically timed detonators. You place them under the truck chassis, against the fuel tanks if possible. They're magnetic, they'll stick. Once activated, you have 4 hours before they ignite. Enough time to be far away." He met her eyes. "You'd need to place 18. One for each truck in the primary target area. It would take multiple visits, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And if you're caught with even one of these, there's no explanation that will save you." The risk was extraordinary, beyond anything Dorothy had done before. This wasn't passing messages or memorizing information. This was active sabotage, the kind that got entire families executed as examples. But she thought about Henri hanging in the square. She thought about the Goldstein family and their empty bookshop. She thought about all the people suffering under occupation, about Allied soldiers who would die if German supplies reached the front lines, about the cost of saying no when saying yes might change the course of the war. She looked at the thermite charges, so small and innocent-looking, containing such destructive power. "Show me how they work," she said. The training took place over 3 nights in the bakery cellar. Marcel taught her how to activate the charges with a small magnetic key, how to place them for maximum effect, how to check that they were properly secured. They practiced on an old cart in the cellar, Dorothy's hands learning the movements until they could perform them by touch alone, until the process took less than 10 seconds per charge. She learned to work in darkness, in cold, with numb fingers and racing heartbeat. She learned to breathe slowly, to keep her hands steady, to move with purpose but without panic. Marcel was a patient teacher, demonstrating again and again, correcting her grip, her positioning, her timing. On the 3rd night, he produced a replica German supply truck's chassis, somehow acquired through the Resistance Network, and had her practice on that. "You'll only get 1 chance with each truck," he said. "If a charge falls off, if it's placed wrong, if someone sees you, it's over. You need to be perfect." Christmas came and went with barely an acknowledgement. The Germans threw a party at the officers' club, their laughter and music drifting to the frozen streets like mockery. Dorothy spent Christmas Eve in the bakery, preparing bread for her next delivery to the depot, her mind running to the plan again and again. She would begin placing charges on her first visit in January, targeting 2 or 3 trucks per trip to avoid suspicion. The thermite buttons would be hidden in a specially modified bread basket, tucked into a false bottom that Marcel had constructed. If she was searched, if the basket was examined closely, she was dead. But if she succeeded, if all 18 charges were placed and detonated simultaneously, while Allied bombers struck from above, the resulting destruction would cripple German supply operations in the entire region. It was worth the risk. It had to be worth the risk. She told herself this over and over, like a prayer. The first placement mission was scheduled for January 7th, 1944. Dorothy woke that morning before dawn, her heart already racing. The thermite charges sat in their hiding place in the basket, 3 small buttons that weighed almost nothing but felt heavier than the entire bicycle. She dressed carefully, layers against the cold, nothing too bulky that would restrict her movement. She braided her hair tightly, splashed ice-cold water on her face, and forced herself to eat bread with butter even though her stomach rebelled at the thought of food. At the door, she paused, looking at the bakery that had become her home, at the worn floorboards and the old oven and the windows that looked out onto a street she'd come to know so intimately. For a moment, she let herself imagine not going, imagine running, imagine being anywhere but here. Then she thought about Henry's body swaying in the wind, and she picked up a bicycle and wheeled it outside into the frozen morning. The ride to the depot was both eternal and instantaneous. The checkpoint guards waved her through with barely a glance. She'd become so familiar, they hardly saw her anymore. The road stretched ahead, gray and hard with ice. Her breath came out in clouds. The bicycle's squeak seemed louder than usual, or maybe that was just her imagination. When the depot came into view, her hands were shaking so badly, she almost lost control on a patch of ice. She steadied herself, forced her breathing to slow, and approached the gate with the same expression she always wore, pleasant, simple, harmless. The guard checked her papers, glanced at the basket of bread, and waved her through. She was in. The officer's mess was on the far side of the compound, which meant Dorothy had to ride past the vehicle storage area. This was intentional, part of her routine, expected and unremarkable. She moved slowly, the bicycle protesting every revolution. 3 trucks were parked near the path, away from the others, positioned for maintenance. The mechanics who usually worked this area were absent. It was early, too early for most activity. Dorothy stopped, as if to adjust her basket, and in one smooth motion, she was beside the first truck. Her hand found the thermite charge, activated it with a twist of the magnetic key, and placed it under the chassis against the fuel tank. It took 8 seconds. 8 seconds that felt like hours. The charge clicked into place, held by its magnetic grip. She stepped back, adjusted her basket again, and continued riding as if nothing had happened. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it would break through her ribs. 2 more trucks were positioned near the mess hall. Dorothy delivered her bread, chatted briefly with the cook, who always complimented her on the quality of her baguettes, and then took a deliberately indirect route back toward the gate. She stopped to retie her shoe near the second truck. The charge went on smoothly, magnetically finding purchase on the cold metal. She stood, brushed dirt from her coat, and moved to the third truck, where she pretended to check her bicycle's squeaking chain. Another charge placed. 3 done. She rode out of the depot feeling simultaneously triumphant and terrified, her body flooded with adrenaline that made everything too bright, too sharp, too real. Over the next 3 weeks, Dorothy placed 15 more charges. Each visit was an exercise in controlled terror. She varied her methods, sometimes stopping to adjust her bicycle, sometimes dropping something and bending to retrieve it, sometimes simply pausing to rest and leaning against a truck. The Germans never suspected. Why would they? She was just a bread delivery woman with a ridiculous rusty bicycle, the harmless American who barely spoke adequate French, the woman who'd been coming 3 times a week for months without incident. She'd become part of the landscape, as Marcel had predicted. So familiar she was invisible. The officers sometimes joked with her. The guards let her through, without checking her papers. She was, in their eyes, nothing worth noticing. But Dorothy noticed everything. She noticed the increasing nervousness among the German soldiers. She noticed new fortifications being built along the coast. She noticed supply shipments arriving more frequently, as if they were stockpiling for something immense. She noticed the way officers studied maps late into the night, their windows glowing with lamplight. The invasion was coming. Everyone could feel it now, a storm gathering on the horizon. The question wasn't if, but when. And when it came, Dorothy's 18 thermite charges would be waiting, silent and patient, counting down the hours until they transformed 18 supply trucks into 18 simultaneous infernos. The final charge was placed on January 28th. It was the most dangerous placement yet, a fuel truck parked directly in front of the main administrative building, in full view of multiple windows and a guard post. Dorothy had no legitimate reason to be in that area, but the truck's location made a crucial target. Its explosion would likely spread to the adjacent ammunition transport, creating a cascade effect that would devastate the entire northern section of the depot. She waited until the delivery was complete, until she'd said her goodbyes at the mess hall, and then she claimed her bicycle had a loose pedal that needed adjustment. She knelt beside it, working on the pedal with exaggerated frustration, slowly edging closer to the fuel truck. The guard at the post was watching her. She could feel his eyes. Her hands fumbled with the tools she'd brought, making it look genuine. Then, as if giving up on the pedal and decided to try something else, she moved to check the bicycle's rear wheel, which brought her alongside the truck. The charge was in her palm. She pretended to lose her balance, put her hand out to catch herself against the truck's chassis, and the thermite button found its home. She stood, brushed herself off, gave the guard an embarrassed wave, and pedaled away on her supposedly repaired bicycle. 18 trucks, 18 charges, all placed, all activated, all ticking toward detonation. The bombing raid was scheduled for February 3rd, weather permitting. Marcel told her this on the evening of February 1st, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've done something extraordinary," he said, and there were tears in his eyes. "Whatever happens, know that. You've given the Allies a gift." Dorothy felt numb. Now that it was done, now that there was nothing left but waiting, the fear she'd been holding at bay came flooding in. She thought about the German soldiers at the depot, some of them barely older than boys, some of them probably conscripts who didn't want to be there any more than the French wanted them there. She thought about the cook who complimented her bread, the young guard who'd once helped her fix a genuine flat tire. They would die in the firestorm. They would burn. War demanded these impossible calculations, their lives against Allied lives, their suffering against the suffering of occupied peoples. There was no good answer, no clean conscience. There was only the choice she'd made and the weight of carrying it forward. February 3rd dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day where the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. Dorothy didn't go to the depot. Her delivery schedule didn't call for it, and she needed to be far away when the charges detonated. She stayed in the bakery, kneading dough with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, listening to the clock tick down the hours. The charges were set for midnight, coordinated with a bombing raid that would come from Allied planes based in England. 12 hours of waiting. 12 hours of second-guessing, of doubt, of prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. She thought about her family in Connecticut, her mother and father, and sisters who had no idea what their Dorothy had become. She wondered if they'd recognize her now, if the war had changed her into someone unrecognizable. She wondered if she'd ever be able to go home, or if home was even real anymore, or if it had become just another story she told herself to make the present bearable. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Dorothy tried to work, tried to read, tried to do anything to occupy her mind. Nothing worked. At sunset, Madame Chunault came to the bakery, bringing soup and bread and a bottle of wine hidden beneath her shawl. They sat together in the small upstairs bedroom. Two women who become sisters through shared danger, and they waited. Madame Chunault held Dorothy's hand and told her stories about France before the war, about festivals and weddings and harvests, about a world that had existed and might exist again. "What you've done," she said, "will be remembered. Maybe not your name, maybe not in any official history, but the impact will ripple forward. You've struck a blow that will reverberate." At 11:30, they heard the air raid sirens begin to wail. The sound was piercing, otherworldly, a mechanical scream that meant death was coming from the sky. Dorothy and Madame Chunault went to a window and looked out at the town plunged into blackout, at the searchlights beginning to sweep the night sky. German soldiers ran through the streets toward defensive positions. Civilians huddled in their homes, in cellars, wherever they thought might offer safety. And then, at exactly midnight, the eastern horizon lit up a flash so bright it turned night to day. The explosion was tremendous, a sound that shook the building's foundations, that rattled every window, that seemed to come not from a distance but from everywhere at once. Dorothy watched as fire bloomed in the sky like a deadly flower, oranges and reds and yellows reaching toward the stars. The thermite charges had worked. All 18 trucks were burning. And seconds later, the Allied bombers arrived. The raid lasted 40 minutes. Wave after wave of bombers came over, dropping their payloads with precision guided by the inferno Dorothy had created. The thermite fires acted as perfect markers, bright enough to see from miles away, indicating exactly where to strike. Explosions rolled across the countryside like thunder. The Germans fired anti-aircraft guns, but the chaos caused by the ground fires had disrupted their coordination. Dorothy watched it all from the window, tears streaming down her face, unsure if they were tears of triumph or grief or simply exhaustion. She had done this. Her rusty bicycle and her careful planning and her courage had created this moment. 18 trucks had become 18 beacons that guided the bombs home. The depot was being destroyed. German supply lines were being severed. An invasion that everyone was waiting for, the liberation of France, had moved one step closer. When the all-clear finally sounded in the early hours of February 4th, Dorothy was still at the window. Smoke rose from the eastern horizon, visible even in the darkness, a pillar that reached toward the stars. The depot was gone. Marcel arrived just after dawn, looking like he'd aged 10 years in one night. He confirmed what Dorothy already knew. The raid had been a complete success. All 18 trucks destroyed, along with most of the depot's buildings and a significant portion of their stored supplies. Casualty numbers were still unclear, but the strategic impact was enormous. "The German command is in chaos," Marcel said. "They're already pulling back from forward positions, trying to consolidate. You've changed the calculation for them. You've made them afraid." He looked at her with something like awe. "They're asking questions about the fires, about how the trucks all ignited simultaneously. They know it was sabotage. They're looking for whoever did it. The danger wasn't over. It was just beginning in a new form. The Germans would investigate, would question everyone with access to the depot, would search for the saboteur who had made fools of them." Dorothy destroyed her bicycle that day, breaking it apart piece by piece and burning the components in the bakery's oven. She destroyed her delivery papers, her route maps, anything that connected her to the depot. She stopped making bread deliveries, claiming illness, staying hidden in the bakery while Marcel and Madame Chunault monitored the German response. For 2 weeks, she barely left the upstairs room, living on tinned food and anxiety, waiting for the knock on the door that would mean they found her. But it never came. The Germans questioned the depot guards, the officers, the mechanics. They arrested 2 French laborers on suspicion of sabotage and executed them publicly as examples. They never thought to investigate the harmless American woman with the rusty bicycle who used to deliver bread. She'd been too perfect in her invisibility, too thoroughly dismissed as irrelevant. They'd mocked her, laughed at her, ignored her, and their contempt had been her greatest protection. By March, the manhunt had subsided. The Germans had larger problems. Allied forces were pressing on multiple fronts. An invasion everyone knew was coming loomed larger with each passing day. Dorothy emerged from hiding gradually, carefully, resuming a version of normal life while remaining constantly vigilant. She reconnected with the resistance network, which was growing bolder now. Sensing that liberation was near, she helped coordinate safe houses for downed Allied pilots, passed information about German troop movements, participated in small acts of sabotage that felt almost mundane after the depot. The rusty bicycle became a legend in the resistance. Stories spread to the network about the American woman who destroyed 18 Nazi trucks while the Germans laughed at her. Marcel told her that British intelligence had mentioned her operation in reports sent to Churchill himself. Madame Chennault embroidered the story until it became almost mythical. But Dorothy tried not to think about it too much. The weight of what she'd done, the lives taken, the fire, the destruction, sat heavy on her conscience, balanced against the lives saved. The invasion brought closer, the hope restored. June 6, 1944, came with gray skies and rough seas. Dorothy woke to the sound of distant bombardment and knew immediately what it meant. The invasion had begun. Allied forces were landing on the beaches of Normandy, fighting their way onto occupied soil, beginning the liberation of France. St. Lo would become a crucial target. Its strategic location made it a key objective for both sides. The battle for the town would be brutal, devastating, reducing much of it to rubble. But on that morning, as Dorothy stood in her bakery and listened to the sounds of war coming closer, she felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Hope. Real, tangible hope that the occupation would end, that France would be free, that the sacrifices made by people like her, like Henri, like the Goldstein family, like so many others, had meant something. The liberation of St. Lo came on July 18th, after weeks of savage fighting. When American soldiers finally entered the town, Dorothy was among the crowds that gathered to greet them. She pushed through the masses of crying, cheering French civilians, until she reached a young lieutenant from a 29th Infantry Division. "I'm American," she told him in English, her accent suddenly thick with Connecticut after years of speaking French. "I'm Dorothy May Sullivan from Hartford. I've been here since 1938. The lieutenant stared at her, this thin woman in a patched dress with haunted eyes and calloused hands. "Ma'am," he said, "we need to get you debriefed. There's intelligence that needs collecting." She shook her head. "Later," she said. "Right now, I just need to stand here and watch my town be free." In the months that followed, Dorothy's story was told to military intelligence officers who filed away in classified reports. She was offered transport back to the United States, but she declined. France felt more like home now than Connecticut ever had. She stayed in St. Lo through the Reconstruction, helping rebuild the bakery, watching the town slowly heal its wounds. She reconnected with her family through letters, trying to explain a journey she knew they could never fully understand. She attended a ceremony where Madame Chennault was honored by the French government for her resistance work. She stood beside Marcel as he accepted recognition for the network he'd helped coordinate. When they offered to recognize her, to tell her story publicly, she refused. Some stories, she felt, were better left in the shadows where they'd been lived. Dorothy May Sullivan lived the rest of her life in France, never returning to the United States except for brief visits. She married a French doctor she met during the Reconstruction, a kind man who'd served as a medic with the resistance and understood the cost of the choices she'd made. They had 2 children, raised them in the rebuilt bakery, taught them about honor and courage and the importance of standing against injustice. She never spoke much about her war years, about the rusty bicycle, about the 18 thermite charges that changed the course of a battle. When her children asked, She would simply say that she'd done what needed to be done, what anyone would have done in her position. But those who'd been there, who'd lived through the occupation and the liberation, they knew better. They knew that not everyone could have done what Dorothy did. They knew that her courage, her patience, her willingness to risk everything for people who weren't even her own had been extraordinary. The depot raid remained classified for decades. It wasn't until the 1980s, when documents were finally declassified, that historians began to piece together the full story. They found references to an American woman with a bicycle, to thermite charges placed with precision, to a sabotage operation that had enabled one of the most successful tactical bombing raids of the war. They found Dorothy's name in intelligence reports, always with commendations, always with notes about her effectiveness and courage. But by then, she was in her 60s, living quietly in her rebuilt town, and she still refused interviews, still kept her silence. Some wounds, she believed, were private. Some victories didn't need to be celebrated publicly to be real. If you stayed with me through Dorothy's entire story, through every moment of fear and courage and sacrifice, then you understand why these histories matter. These aren't just tales from the past. They're reminders of what ordinary people can do in extraordinary circumstances. They're testaments to the courage that lives in all of us, waiting for the moment when we'll need to reach deep and find it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the price that was paid for freedoms we often take for granted, then please take a moment to like this video. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people, helps ensure that sacrifices like Dorothy's are never forgotten. And if you've made it this far, if you've truly been with me until the end, leave a comment saying, "I honor their courage." It helps me know that this content is reaching the people who truly value it. There are so many more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories of ordinary people who became extraordinary when history demanded it. The next video continues this journey, exploring another forgotten hero whose actions changed the course of the war. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.